All right, everybody, I am back and I am going to continue with my quest to review every single video on moral realism and anti-realism on the entirety of the internet. And if you're just tuning in for the first time, this is episode 1612. No, I'm playing around. I don't know how many I've done. There's a lot of them. So let's get into it. Let's see who has popped into the comments since I went live. I don't know who went first, so we'll give it to Eric because he was first the first time and first the second time. So Eric, I think this is your first time being here, but you'll get 1,000 Lance loot, and Nitty, you get 500, but you get another 500 for plugging me in the Myth Vision Discord. So you both get 1,000, so you're tied. All right, and then who else do we have? Tony, I think you were here before I got started, so we'll give it to Jonah. That's 250. Jonah says meta ethics again, baby. That's exactly right. This is the meta ethics channel. I think at this point, I might have more episodes or like more videos on meta ethics than anybody anywhere on the internet. And since like it's like everything before this was pre-internet, that means I have the most videos on meta ethics in history, right? Don't I? I think so. It's like 100 of them or something. If someone has more, I want to know about it because I should know that person. Maybe we'll disagree, but I still want to know them. All right, so today we're going to be reviewing a video I just saw today. It's only a 9-minute video, so I have to be able to get through it, and it's only going to take 2 hours instead of 14 hours. All right, what's up, Mason? Yeah, so Eric, you get 1,000 Lance loot. You probably got a lot of Lance loot from back in the day, so you could probably buy a lot of stuff with it. Sorry, I'm getting thirsty before I even started. Yeah, sometimes I just monologue for an hour and then I'm parched. All right, so not much other stuff. I did do a recording where we ended up kind of discussing. You'll see my guests and all that stuff. It's already edited and all that stuff on kind of like the sociology of philosophy. That we just kind of went with where the conversation took us. So that'll be up probably in the next few days. So I got another. So it's not on meta ethics. Meta ethics comes up a bit, but it wasn't primarily focused on that. But here's another meta ethics one. So let's get right into the video. And it starts right off with like Dawkins's face, right up in your face. Okay, so I'm gonna play this. Let me know. I thought the audio on this video was a bit on the low side, so let me know if it's low. Although I guess it's already a maximum, so there's not much I could do for you. So if it's too low, then too bad for us, I guess. So let's get going.
Especially internet atheists, will often object to the God of the Bible on moral grounds. They will say that God
I
is
didn't
evil.
like that started. It started like 1 second into it. Okay, let's go.
Atheists, especially internet atheists, will often object to the God of the Bible on moral grounds. They will say that God is evil or certain things he commands are evil and so on and so forth. And when atheists make these claims, they are assuming that they have accurate moral knowledge. They think that they
Already an issue. Okay, so first, can people let me know in the chat how it's sounding on your end? Because it's still definitely sounding quite low for me. Please let me know. And I'm not sure if there's anything I could do to adjust it. Can someone let me know? How was that audio? It's good? Okay, so someone's saying it's a bit. Is it enough that you could hear it? Okay. All right, so okay, so I'll just push the mic out a little bit. Okay, so let me start it again, and I push the mic back a bit, so that should lower my volume, and I could probably lower the gain a bit on this for the volume. All right, how is my volume sounding? Is it sounding okay? Test, test, test. I just want to make sure I got it right before we get too far into the video. Let me start it over, and then
atheists,
okay,
especially
so that's
internet
playing.
atheists,
How
will
is my
often object
voice?
to the God of the Bible on moral.
Okay, great. Okay, good. So let's start it over. So atheists. We're starting with atheists. Okay, cool. Yeah, by the way, the recording I did, my Blue Yeti right here wasn't working. So the audio from me is terrible. Ugh. It refused to work, and I was on a schedule. So what could I do? I don't know what's up with StreamYard. Anyway, let's get into it.
Atheists, especially internet atheists, will often object the God of the Bible on moral grounds. They will say that God is evil or certain things he commands are evil and so on and so forth. And when atheists make these claims, they are assuming that they have accurate moral knowledge. They think that they can have some degree of confidence that their moral convictions hold to some type of objective standard. If they
So this is not true. Atheists that appeal to like problem of evil, problem of suffering type stuff are often making critiques that are appealing to the standards of the person that they're presenting the argument to. So, provided that, let's say you're a Christian or you're a theist and you think there is a God and God has certain characteristics like being perfectly good, and someone argues, hey, if God is perfectly good, that would carry certain implications. And some of your other commitments that you have, like the theist or the Christian, would be inconsistent with that. So, what they could try to do is show inconsistencies in your own views. And that doesn't require that they believe that they have moral knowledge. That doesn't require that they are a moral realist. It doesn't require them to take any particular stance on morality at all. It could function entirely as an internal critique, a critique that challenges the consistency between two or more commitments that the theist or the Christian or whoever they're arguing against has. It does not require the critic themselves to endorse moral realism or claim to have moral knowledge. And there are variations on these sorts of arguments. You could point out something that Danny from Field Talk will point out, like if God is supposed to be loving, you could ask questions about sort of thick or descriptive concepts like being loving or being kind or being like concepts that have a normative component, but that also have substantive descriptive elements. So those concepts, you can ask, hey, would a loving parent treat their children a certain way? And if a person is like, well, no, they wouldn't do that. And you could then appeal to, okay, well, if God was a loving creator of humankind, would God be expected to treat us in this particular way? And so you could expose potentially an inconsistency between your notion that God is a loving being and certain actions that God performs or certain ways that God has treated people historically or according to doctrines or scripture or whatever it is that you believe. So again, these sorts of objections don't necessarily require that the person presenting them is appealing to what they take to be objective or stance independent moral truth. That's one thing that could be going on. And if there are problems with consistently adopting a realist perspective as an atheist and then attempting to leverage a realist perspective against a theist, maybe that could be a problem. So this could be a problem for some atheists in principle, but that if that's the case, that would narrow the scope of this sort of critique only to those positions at best. I don't think it's the case that all critiques of the problem of evil or any sort of adjacent types of critiques require that the critic endorse moral realism or presuppose that they have more moral knowledge. I don't see why we would think that that's the case. All right.
didn't have this confidence, then their moral objections to God wouldn't really mean much. What I want to do in this video is show that most of these atheists hold positions which actually undercut their ability to have any type of moral knowledge. In doing this, I will be drawing on a paper written by Mark Linville in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. I also want
No, he did say most atheists. So there isn't some sort of claim that there's some sort of entailment. If you're an atheist, you can't hold this view.
to make clear what this argument is not arguing. This is not an argument that atheists cannot live morally respectable lives, nor is this an argument that moral value cannot possibly exist under atheism. This is an argument that combining an evolutionary account of our origins with a naturalistic view of the world knowledge. If I see people in the comments misrepresenting this argument, I'm likely going to call you out on it. So with that,
Note, by the way, that there's a difference. There's a difference between an atheist. That phrasing is going to make me go insane. I don't know why it keeps doing that. There is a there's a difference between a critique of atheists and a critique of someone that specifically holds particular views about naturalism and the role evolution plays in morality. And I think that's going to be another major concern that I have with the critique that's laid out in this video. You know, if it's a critique of naturalist atheists that specifically believe that moral cognition is a product of natural selection, okay, but that might be a view many atheists hold. And no, they I think they had said something like most atheists. this could be narrowly targeted specifically at people that hold those views. I didn't see some claim that like all atheists think this way, or if you're an atheist, you have to be a naturalist or whatever. So those sorts of problems are not being made here, and that's a good thing. So I'm happy with that. I'm happy that this is properly couched at targeting a specific mindset that atheists may have. So, oftentimes critics of atheism will conflate atheism with naturalism or physicalism or whatever, and I don't think that's happening here.
That said, let's get started. Linville's argument goes as follows. Premise 1, if evolution and naturalism are true, human morality is a byproduct of natural selection. Premise 2, if human morality is a byproduct of natural selection, then there is no moral knowledge. Premise 3, there is moral knowledge, therefore conclusion, evolution and naturalism are not true.
All right. So I have a number of concerns with this, and I'm curious for the audience, what premises in these argument do you take issue with? So I think that there could potentially be issues with pretty much any of these premises. I'm also a little concerned with the lack of clarity in what it means to have moral knowledge. Is this knowledge of stance independent moral facts? Like, is it moral knowledge that's specific to realism? Because if you're some sort of constructivist, let's say you're an ideal observer theorist, and you think that moral facts are facts that an ideally rational and fully informed agent would endorse, you're technically an anti-realist. And you may very well still believe that there is moral knowledge, because one could have knowledge of what that being would favor. And so you would still be some sort of like constructivist or stance dependent cognitivist that would endorse only stance dependent moral facts. You're an anti-realist, but you would still think that we could have moral knowledge. I wish when people were presenting arguments like this that they would include the specific presuppositions, the meta-ethical presuppositions in the premises explicitly, rather than them being implicit or made outside the context of the premises as they're sort of formally laid out. There's no good reason not to do that. It doesn't take a lot of words to add there is stance and moral knowledge of stance independent moral facts, or there is moral knowledge in a realist sense, or whatever. You could even add another premise that this knowledge is knowledge of stance independent moral facts, and you wouldn't have to have these like grossly long premises. Not that the first two premises here aren't fairly long as far as premises go, anyway. So why not make that clear? I don't understand the rationale in not making that clear. So yeah, I'm curious. I'm seeing just someone posting one. I'm right. See, what's that about, Patrick? Uh, so I'm curious what premises here you would take issue with. Nitty, I don't know if that's a particularly plausible suggestion. Nitty says P1 could be rejected. Human morality could be imposed by aliens. It could be, but it's not. Come on now. So Latdier says stance-dependent cognitivist. Yeah, so that's the term I prefer to use for the sort of traditional three anti-realist positions. So in ethical intuitionism, Humer cashes it out, I think, as error theory. Does he say expressivism or non-cognitivism? Let's go with expressivism. Error theory, expressivism, and I think the last one he gives is subjectivism. Problem is subjectivism is used in all sorts of ways. It's used in ways that don't really have to do with metaethics. It's used in different ways in metaethics. Sometimes it's used to refer to stance-dependent accounts. Sometimes it's used to refer to all forms of relativism. Sometimes it's used to refer to individual relativism. So there's at least three uses there within metaethics, and then several uses outside of metaethics. Not a good term to use. It's too inconsistent in its established uses, much less as a term used in ordinary language that has a bunch of other meanings too. So subjective, not a good term to use. And Humer is careful to make clear that he's actually including like constructivist positions in there too. But those subjective? And then other people will use the term constructivist, and then they'll include relativist positions in there. But they're not really. Are they really constructivist positions? I'm not so sure that they are. So what all of those views have in common: constructivism, and we could take ideal observer theory, human, the dang freezing, Humean constructivism, every type of relativism, whatever type of constructivism you want, some type of relation designated account, ideal observer theory. What do they all have in common? Well, one, There are moral facts on these views. So their stance, they think that there are moral facts. 2, those moral facts are stance dependent. And 3, because of this, they think that there are truths. There are true claims about what's morally right or wrong. And so they're cognitivist accounts. And so they're stance dependent cognitivist accounts. That's what they all have in common. So why not call them that? I don't know of anybody in the literature that has done this. It wouldn't surprise me if someone has somewhere. I'm not claiming I am the originator of this particular way of framing it, but I think that the terms should be probably like non-cognitivism, stance-dependent cognitivism, and error theory, something like that. I don't really like expressivism, non-cognitive. Like, pick one and run with that. These days, everybody seems to like expressivism for some reason. And there's like historical reasons probably for that. I don't know them. Talk to a historian. All right. So let's have a look at what people have said about the argument. Latour says, I think most people don't know about metaethics. It's kind of complicated and the terminology is counterintuitive. I agree. Nitty says, it's not a good objection. It's funny. Okay, well, fair enough. All right. Jonah says, even if P1 held, evolution remains compatible with non-naturalism. I think that's true. Jimothy says, reject all three due to ambiguity. Yeah, so you're sometimes going to have issues, especially if you have something like modus ponens or modus tollens, where technically you can't simultaneously reject both premises. Because you get a contradiction. And I went over that in a previous video, like why that's the case. You have to reject one or the other. And you could do a truth table and test this, and you'll see you can't reject both at the same time. So P3, does everyone accept that? Well, I certainly don't. If by moral knowledge we mean knowledge in like a realist sense, then no, of course I'm not going to accept P3. So that's going to be a problem. Hayden Walton says, is this humorous? No. If you go back a few minutes in the video, they mentioned who was presenting this argument. So I don't know if the audience has a guess which of these premises I'm actually going to focus on, aside from P3, which obviously I don't accept. So that'll develop as the video goes on.
This argument is deductively valid, which means if the premises are true, the conclusion logically follows. Now, premise 3, the statement that there is moral knowledge, is no doubt controversial to some thinkers who deny any objectivity to our moral values. But this argument is not.
Yeah, see, so they are presupposing objectivity or realism, presumably. It's unclear because sometimes people use objective in a way that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as stance independent.
Aimed towards such thinkers. This
Sorry,
argument
I
is
interrupted
aimed
him in the
that
middle
there
of the
is moral
sentence.
knowledge is no doubt controversial to some thinkers who deny any objectivity to our moral values. But this argument is not aimed towards such thinkers. This argument is aimed at people who agree that there are objective values and that we can have knowledge of these objective values. Like I said earlier, the people who object to the morality of God assume this type of moral knowledge in order to make their arguments.
Yeah, as I said, I don't think that that's true. You have to assume realism to present these like objections to the morality of God. Why?
The only premises left to defend at this point are premises 1 and premises 2, which is the subject to which the remainder of this video will be addressed.
Even so, I don't think the claim that people that present these sorts of arguments must presuppose or do presuppose moral realism. In fact, some of them probably explicitly reject it and would insist that they're making some sort of internal critique or some sort of critique that appeals to consistency or something on the part of the person they're presenting the argument against. But even if that's the case, one could just say, okay, well, that's fine. This is still an argument that's narrowly construed in such a way so as to be directed against naturalist, whatever other conditions that need to be met for this, naturalist, atheist, realists that think that we can have moral knowledge. This criticism is directed at them, and that would be fine. Then you could set aside premise 3 and just say, okay, well, if you don't accept premise 3, it's not really my goal in this video, or with respect to this argument to defend it. I'm going to focus on other ones. That's totally fine. So I don't see any issue with doing that.
The defense of these two.
One moment. Let me just look over that second premise again. Immorality is byproduct. Yeah, there's something a little strange here. Note, if evolution and naturalism are true, human morality is a byproduct of natural selection. The phrasing there is a little weird. So typically, when you're talking about natural selection, um, there would be traits, so heritable characteristics that would be selected for. Those aren't byproducts. Those are the things that are selected for. So, like wings or teeth, or a certain kind of blood type, or photoreceptors in the eye. Those aren't byproducts. Those are the products. A byproduct might be some sort of characteristic or trait that was not directly selected for, but is associated with or comes along uh, for the ride as a product of some trait that is selected for. So it could be that your intestinal system or your digestive system is a product of natural selection. And one of the byproducts of that is that you produce certain types of waste product. Like, it's not the case that natural selection favored people like going to the bathroom like because that was directly adaptive. It's that it's adaptive to it, get rid of that waste material. It's not like that is the adaptation. So we have some adaptations for acquiring nutrients for the environment, and then we need, but that doesn't mean that like our ability to like poop and pee isn't a product of natural selection. It is. What I'm saying is that the production of urine is not like something that like we need to do because it's really useful to produce urine directly. It's a byproduct of other things that we need to do, and then we have adaptations for dealing with that. That's I guess you could say one attempt at trying to offer an example of one. I think one that I saw is that like bones are white, like the color of bones is a byproduct. It's not like the color of our bones is like really important for from a natural selection perspective, but it's a byproduct of the stuff that makes up our bones. So, not every single trait that an organism has is a product of natural selection. So, having looked at this, I didn't think about this the first time, but now that I'm looking at it, if evolution and natural selection are true, human morality is a byproduct of natural selection. Well, why would that be true? Why would it have to be a byproduct? Why couldn't it be a direct product of natural selection? So there's something a little weird about these premises. They seem to be assuming that morality is a byproduct and not a result of natural selection directly. If that's what's meant here, maybe byproducts being used in some other way. We could try to be charitable. But if that's what's meant, then I would just say, yeah, the first premise is just false because it doesn't follow that if evolution and naturalism are true, human morality is a byproduct of natural selection. I'll have some more to say about that as well. If we look at the second premise, if human morality is a byproduct of natural selection, then there is no moral knowledge. It's a little weird to say there is no moral knowledge rather than saying we can't have moral knowledge, but I get that's just me being pedantic. But if human morality is a byproduct of natural selection, then there is no moral knowledge. It's unclear why that would be true. So, I'm not sold on any of these premises, but let's keep going.
Premises comes from reflecting on the nature of Darwinian evolution. Regarding premise 1, it is worth noting that the naturalist usually thinks that our mental states are either reducible to or contingent on some physical states in the brain. If the Darwinian origin story is correct, the brain was developed by a process which was governed by natural selection. If there was some mutation which caused the brain to produce mental states which held moral content, and the production of these mental states aided in survival, then natural selection would account for that. Thus, under the conjunction of naturalism and evolution, our moral intuitions are not substantially different from our hunger, our thirst, our itches, or our sexual desires. These are all phenomena which occur because they have aided us in survival. While premise 1 may seem uncontroversial to many, premise 2 is
All right. So premise one should be controversial. So I had said that I'm not just going to have an issue with premise three. I actually have an issue with premise one. I reject premise one. And you might go, oh my gosh, do you reject evolution? Absolutely not. Of course, humans are a product of evolution. I mean, there's certainly things that are special about humans, but I don't think that we have any sort of non physical abilities. I don't think that we've transcended our animality. We are animals. We are apes, and we are not remarkable in any special metaphysical sense. We're remarkable in many of our capacities and abilities, but yeah, human brains are shaped by natural selection. A whole bunch of stuff. A lot of the stuff that was mentioned, hunger, emotions. A lot of this stuff is are a lot of these characteristics that we have, psychological characteristics, were selected for, and they are a product of natural selection. But just because The human brain is a product of natural selection. And just because human behavior is shaped by evolution, even if you endorse evolution, you do believe humans are a product of evolution, and that natural selection shaped human psychology. It actually does not follow that morality is a product. And we could set aside this issue of being a byproduct. We could just say a product of natural selection, one or the other. It does not follow that, in other words, assuming you're a naturalist, you believe in evolutionary theory, and you think humans are a product of natural selection, doesn't follow that morality is a product of biological evolution. Why? Well, take something like the game Monopoly or the game Uno or the game StarCraft. Is playing StarCraft a product of evolution? What about playing chess? Are the rules of chess a product of evolution? Do we have an innate evolved predisposition to understand and employ the rules of chess? Probably not. I would say no. We don't have those abilities. So humans, humans are different from pretty much every other organism on the planet in that, well, animals do sometimes pass on learned skills from one generation to the next. And there's like new stuff with epigenetics and things like that. By and large, humans differ from other organisms in that we are highly adapted to cumulative cultural evolution. So we don't just rely on the transmission of evolved behavioral predispositions that are transferred exclusively through our genes. So, something like a spider, maybe its ability to build a web or something like that is almost entirely a product, or if not absolutely entirely a product, natural selection, where its genes, wire up its brain in a certain way where it knows how to make a web. I don't know enough about spider evolution to be sure of that, but a lot of, like, I don't know, nest building tendencies and other sorts of behavioral proclivities that animals exhibit are a direct product of natural selection. You could say, in a certain sense, they're wired up to carry out those behaviors and do, perform those sorts of activities. What about humans? Is every single thing that we do a product of natural selection? Well, you could say, in a certain trivial sense, that since humans evolved to have a predisposition to develop culture and pass on cultural knowledge from one generation to the next, that everything that we do is trivially a product of natural selection. You could say that, but I don't find that very compelling, because it overlooks an important distinction between there being some sort of cognitive system or predisposition that you could say is innate. It would emerge in the absence of some sort of substantive environmental input. Even for certain sorts of innate abilities, they might require certain sorts of environmental stimuli to develop properly or something like that. So these distinctions can blur into one another. But because like something like vision. So is our ability to see, is that a product of culture? No, it's a biological ability. But if you kept babies in dark rooms or something like that, their vision might not develop properly. So even innate traits or abilities may require certain types of environmental input to undergo their sort of expected development. So be that as it may, it's still the case that other sorts of capacities that we learn are not the sort of thing that under ordinary environmental conditions you would need some sort of special culturally distinctive or idiosyncratic input in order for them to emerge. What about what I'm doing right now? I'm speaking English. So, in the absence of any external stimuli specifically to teach one English or for one to have the right kind of stimuli to learn English, would people just speak English? No. The ability to speak English is not an innate ability. The ability to play chess is not an innate ability. It's not a direct product of natural selection. Many things that humans have a capacity for may very well be a product of natural selection, but many other things have to be acquired culturally. And it may be that we have a biological predisposition to pick up languages, or we have the biological predisposition. We have like the cognitive apparatuses in place that would allow us to speak. Like we have the right kind of physiology to allow us to speak. Other organisms couldn't speak even if they had the right kind of cognition because they don't have the right kind of physiology. We do. So some of that might have been influenced by natural selection, and clearly a lot of the cognitive precursors that would allow for language to develop and persist among humans, that's in place because we have language. And That's not the case with many other organisms where they just don't have the cognitive capacity for language, even if they had somehow the physiology, which they probably don't. So we do have at least the right kinds of traits to allow for language to emerge. We also have the right kinds of traits to allow for hockey to emerge, for literacy to emerge, for the ability to create and direct Game of Thrones as a TV show to emerge. But none of those are innate abilities. They are learned. Now, I'm giving quite a bit of background here, but the issue here is that it is not some sort of entailment. It's certainly not a logical entailment of a belief in natural selection that morality specifically is a product or a byproduct of any particular set of selective pressures that gave rise to morality. Morality, too, could be a cultural product. I happen to think that it is. I do not think moral cognition, a distinctive capacity for thinking in moral terms and making moral judgments, I don't think that's a product of natural selection. I think it's cultural. Uh, I'm not the only person that thinks this. So Edouard Mashry has a relatively short paper. I give it in my classes on moral psychology called Morality, a Historical Invention, where he argues for this point. Stephen Stitch argues that there is no moral domain. And I also like to give people that article. It's called The Moral Domain. And Stitch says, researchers have tried, philosophers and psychologists have both attempted to delineate the distinctive metanormative and other sorts of characteristics that would allow us to reliably distinguish moral norms from other sorts of norms, like epistemic and prudential norms. And Stitch thinks the answer to why this has proven so intractable over the years is that there is no moral domain. This is, there are reasons why there wouldn't necessarily be a distinctive moral domain. And, I don't know if I want to digress the whole video to get into a whole thing about that. Maybe I'll do a video on it at some point. I will talk about the Mashry and Malin paper, though. So I'll get to that. I want to look at the chat, too, and see a bit more of the video. But I'll get to the Mashry and Malin paper in, the Handbook of Moral Psychology. It's one of my favorite papers. I'm always recommending it to people. Basically, so I endorse gene culture coevolutionary accounts like Richardson and Boyd. So I endorse views of the way in which human evolution has occurred, where humans evolved a capacity for culture, and that genetic evolution and cultural evolution dynamically interact with one another. So changes in culture can create selective pressures that influence our genetics, and changes in our genetics can in turn influence the way culture manifests and develops. And so the two work in tandem with one another to create a rather unique state of affairs where there are two different selective forces co-occurring simultaneously and are intertwined with one another. And I believe that those two forces operate in conjunction to produce the current repertoire of human behavior that we have today. In fact, I think that this runs so deep that not only do I think that morality is a product of cultural evolution and is not a direct product of natural selection, I actually think the same of language. I don't think we have an innate ability for language. So I think Chomsky's wrong about this. I reject universal grammar, and I endorse the views that are outlined in The Language Game by Christensen and Chater. So it's certainly not to deny that evolution has played a massive role in natural selection and biological evolution. I mean, not cultural evolution, has played a massive role in shaping human cognition and allowing there to be in place the right kinds of psychological toolkit for language to emerge. That would have to be the case for it to emerge. Like we have to have the right kinds of cognitive capacities. But note that none of that is to imply any sort of teleology or that any of this. It's not like natural selection is like, ooh, we got to get language at some point. We can't get it through natural selection, like biologically, but we could get it culturally. So let's add this little trait, let's add that little trait, and then the language will emerge. It doesn't have any foresight. Natural selection has never had any foresight. So you could say language is a byproduct. You could say morality is a byproduct if you want. But you could say that anything produced by culture is a byproduct, but what exactly does that mean? And, why exactly would that necessarily be a problem or bar you from having moral knowledge? I'll say a bit more on that too. So let me make a note here just because I don't want to forget to talk about the Mashry and Malin paper. And what was the other thing that I wanted to talk about? I just forgot what I was talking about. If someone in the chat can remind me, remind me. Otherwise, maybe I'll just forget it, and then I'll look at this video later and go, "Ah, that was stupid." I'm seeing lots of stuff in the chat, so I want to address it. Okay, let's have a look at what people are saying. Oh wow, so many people here. Mason says, "I also reject P3." All right. LMAO AOH says, "I know that voice." What voice? If we assume the validity, it can help us understand. Okay, no. So many comments about Richard Dawkins. Yeah, I know there was like 2 seconds of Richard Dawkins at the beginning of the video. Not a big deal. Made by Jim Bob says P1 is false. If naturalism is true, there are only events. Morality is a metaphysical concept that can't be known, can't be a known byproduct. Yeah, that's going to depend on what you mean by morality. And so I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. Uh, different people are going to have different conceptions of what morality is. And one of the limitations of compressing everything into, you know, short premises is that you would have to unpack what's meant by the terms involved. So what's meant by human morality here? Is this referring to moral judgment, moral institutions and practices? Because clearly those exist, and it's unclear why they couldn't exist if naturalism were true. But that would be different from morality as such. So if one's view of morality is that morality is this like metaphysical notion, there's this transcendent body of metaphysical truths, these moral facts out there, then human morality wouldn't be a product of natural selection. That would be a weird. How would that happen? I mean, maybe you have a weird partial natural selection like divine view, and you think divine traits and transcendent capacities could evolve. I guess you could think that, but if you're thinking purely in naturalistic terms, something like with a ontological qualities that couldn't be a direct product of natural selection. Certainly, those are not going to be a product of natural selection, especially if you're stipulating that the traits you have in mind couldn't be. So, yeah, if you're conceiving of morality that way, then it wouldn't be able to be a byproduct of natural selection. But it's unclear what's meant specifically here by human morality. So this is pulled from a paper where the person might and hopefully does elaborate on precisely what's meant here. So keep in mind, I'm looking at a short 9-minute video. They're reviewing an article. The article might have more details that flesh some of this out a bit more. All right. Anti-Desert Dweller Brigade says this guy's owning atheist. Evolution is always self-defeating. If evolution is true, show no it's ridiculous, then everything becomes silly and you have to be dumb to believe it. I don't know if you're serious or not. I don't know if you're serious or not. But I don't think that. And I don't, like you say, which we all know is ridiculous. I don't think evolution is ridiculous. Mason Colbert says, why do atheists discount sexual selection as another route by which selection for traits occurs? I don't know that they do. They might just lump that in with natural selection. I would. I don't, I would see it as I don't know what evolutionary biologists do. I haven't kept up with evolution stuff in many years, and I didn't like study it in grad school or something. What did I do? Read some Dawkins books. So all right. Deus Ex Nihilo says I'd probably reject all the premises, although P1 to me it depends on how broad morality. I think you mean being a byproduct of natural selection is, because that could be trivially true. Right. Yeah. And I mentioned earlier that there's ways of construing it being a byproduct that would make it trivially true. All right. So made by Jim Bob says naturalism entails P1. I don't think so for the reasons that I've stated here. So again, though, it might depend on what you mean by human morality as a byproduct of natural selection. Um, it sounded to me like they were implying that human morality would be an adaptation, that some capacity for distinctive moral cognition would be an adaptation. But that's not clear in the video, at least not clear yet. And I don't remember exactly what they say after this. And if that's the case, then that wouldn't follow. Hayden says there's more smuggling going on here than the Columbia Mail Service. Well, to be fair to this sort of argument, again, the argument is appearing in like is extracted from a paper, and there might be broader context. Whenever you're presenting an argument like this, you have to compress a lot, and then you have to sort of surround that, at least if you're doing your job well, by saying, okay, well, here's what I mean by moral knowledge. Here's what I mean by human morality. Here's what I mean by natural selection. Here's what I mean by, you know, if naturalism is true. Like, you might have to unpack all the components of the premises, um, and explain. And when you do that, then you're not necessarily smuggling things. It's just that it'd be like if I said, "Hey, explain, you know, the history of World War One in 4 sentences." It would be a little weird to say, "Ah, you're intentionally excluding all these details." Well, you wouldn't be. You have no ability to do anything other than summarize it to the best that you can in 4 sentences. Uh, you know, you're going to have to omit things, and that's just what happens with formal arguments. So. Yeah, Deus Ex Nihilo says P1 just isn't necessary. And that's really the point I want to stress, is that I just don't think a clear, non-trivial formulation of P1 is going to end up being true. So I think it's either going to be trivially true in a way that's uninteresting and may not sustain P2, or it's just not going to be true. So, and I suspect it's going to end up being the latter. Mason Colbert mentions, says, also, although controversial, group selection theory is defended by some ecologists and evolutionary biologists, albeit a minority position. I don't think that's going to help with responding to this argument, though. How would you, so made by Jim Bob says, how would you determine any event isn't a byproduct of evolution? What methodology? Well, the first thing you'd have to do is get clear on what it would mean for something to be a byproduct of evolution. So if someone just says, look, any behavior that humans exhibit is either going to be the direct product of some innate evolved mechanism, or it's going to be the product of some set of psychological mechanisms that were the product of natural selection. Okay, well, then it's trivially true. Literally anything a person does is a product of or a byproduct of evolution, because that would capture all human behavior. And so then you wouldn't be able to show that that's not true, because it'd be trivially true. I mean, you might as well just say, if it's a behavior, it's a product or byproduct of evolution or natural selection. No way around it then. So someone would hopefully have to give you some sort of non-trivial account of what they mean by a byproduct of natural selection. Again, though, I still have concerns about calling it a byproduct of natural selection rather than saying a product of natural selection. I don't know what work the byproduct part of this is doing. So it wouldn't be possible to really determine what you could or couldn't do to distinguish something as being a byproduct or not, unless we got clear on what was meant by byproduct. So once you did do that, though, like if you want to draw a distinction between things that are a product of an innate evolved mechanisms and things that aren't, there's a variety of things that you could look at. You could look for certain sorts of genetic correlations between certain like behavior. So, hey, do variation in particular alleles result in different behavioral dispositions? That's going to be super hard to test, especially in humans. You could look at things like, does the trait emerge early in human development? Does it emerge in many different cultures? The more those cultures don't interact with one another, the better. You could look for other sorts of things. You could look for, certain sorts of localization in parts of the brain. So if certain parts of the brain appear to be specialized in dealing with certain sorts of information, that would indicate that the capacity in question is not a product of culture, but is a product of is some sort of adaptation. So you have parts of the brain that are more associated with like visual processing, and then like the occipital lobe, so something like that. There are difficulties with all of these sorts of things. So hey, okay, so something emerges early in human development. Does that mean it's necessarily a product of natural selection? No. Why? Well, it could be that a bunch of cultures, for whatever reason, or all the cultures we look at, have the same culture practices, and that children pick up on them really, really quickly for whatever reason. And so it's still a product of culture, and it shows up really early. It could also be that certain features of our environment cue people to exhibit certain sorts of behavioral patterns. So, you know, certain sorts of things can be caused by the environment and not by some sort of evolved ability. So people referencing the sun, do we have an innate psychological predisposition to talk about the sun? No, it's just that people all over the world could look up and see the damn sun. So of course they're going to be like, yeah, there's that big hot thing in the sky. the big bright thing that makes things hot. That the ability to reference and discuss the sun and refer to it, it doesn't need to be a product of natural selection, because in other words, shared features of our environment or early capacity for learning both could interfere with our ability to detect something that is a product of some sort of innate mechanism. uh, you would have to talk to someone that specializes in this stuff to see how exactly they would disentangle all of this. So, all right, see what else we got. All right. Looks like some people arguing with each other in the chat. That's fine. I'm glad to see people here arguing with each. All right. Wow. Lots of stuff. Sorry, still looking at the comments. As far as people are like, why are presuppositionalists here? Maybe because the video I'm reviewing is like are they an apologist, or it's about atheists, or maybe it was the picture of Richard Dawkins. I don't know. I'm happy to have everybody here. I don't care, as long as everybody's nice to each other. All right. Okay. Wow. Still more comments. Still more comments. Again, it's mostly people arguing with each other, trying to get caught up, though. Wow. Okay. Nitty is really going to bat for me. Nitty says 25 people watching and 8 likes. Let's get more likes. How are we doing at the likes? Let me check it. Let's see. Did that actually get more people to like it? I got 15. Thanks, Nitty. Appreciate it. I'll give you 100 more Lance Loot for that. Thank you. So what you got 1100 so far. All right, let's keep going with the video.
Is less likely to be agreeable. What justifies such a brash premise? Well, premise 2 is justified by noting that if natural selection is focused on survival and not truth, there does not seem to be any reason to think that the beliefs which are selected for survival will also be beliefs that are true. Natural selection only pays attention to what helps an organism survive. If there is some mutation which causes the brain to produce a set of false beliefs, and that set of false beliefs is adaptive, well, then it's likely to be selected for. Linville expresses this sentiment saying, "It seems that a plausible Darwinian yarn may be spun in such a way as to offer a complete and exhaustive explanation of our various moral beliefs without ever supposing that any of them are true." Now, given that our cognitive faculties are focused on survival and not truth, we therefore cannot be warranted or justified in any of our moral beliefs. If our beliefs are not warranted, then they cannot be known. Let me unpack that a bit and make it simpler. If our evolutionary
So one issue here would be whether, and this is a standard sort of point people would be inclined to make, and I don't know that it specifically rescues morality, because morality may not benefit from the same point when it's points that are made when it comes to something like perception may or may not apply to morality. So take something like visual perception. So in that case, is having true perceptions of the world around us going to be selectively advantageous? Yeah. So correctly seeing that there's a tiger there is going to provide a selective advantage over failing to see a tiger there. So in that case, like when it comes to human sensory capacities, having ones that function so as to provide us with true information about the state of the world is going to be adaptive. And so truth and adaptation are going to be well aligned there. It's not so clear that we need to have true moral beliefs for them to be adaptive. So, all the moral beliefs need to do to be adaptive is to facilitate our reproductive fitness. They don't have to be true. And so they don't have to map on to the world in any way so as to like capture their stance independent facts out there in the world. And even when it comes to certain aspects of human cognition that are, associated with perception or other sorts of cognitive capacities, they don't have to be perfectly aligned with furnishing us with true beliefs. Now, I'm a pragmatist about truth, so uh, some of these issues may be less of an issue for me than they would be for a correspondence theorist or something like that. But I'm fine with saying it's entirely possible for natural selection to have selected for people to systematically have hallucinations or misrepresentations about what the world is like, in the ways that would be problematic, for these sorts of critiques to go through. So I don't have a huge problem with these critiques in the abstract. So yeah, it is entirely possible, at least in principle, for uh, our evolved psychological predispositions to incline us to believe things are true, or that there are ways that the world is that it isn't that way, and we have those capacities because it enhances our reproductive fitness. And that would be a problem, because what if morality is one of those things? Well, then maybe on recognizing that your moral beliefs are a product of natural selection, and that selective process was not truth tracking, that would undermine your belief. And then you would get some sort of, evolutionary debunking argument of morality. So I think that something like that could cause serious concerns for someone that would otherwise want to believe in moral truth in principle. For me, I would just say, okay, maybe that happened. I don't care. Uh, Now there are, I'll get to one type of response that is related to my rejection of sorry, that's related to my rejection of the notion that moral cognition is an adaptation, and that instead morality is a cultural artifact. It's a cultural construction. Because I think that there are features of the way that human cognition may have evolved that you could point to that could buffer us against these sorts of concerns, potentially.
History had played out differently, you could very well have had a completely different set of moral intuitions. Under different circumstances, you could have evolved to think that sexual assault was virtuous or that a mother eating her baby is perfectly fine. Given that all these intuitions were selected for based on whether they helped us survive and not whether these moral intuitions, actually correspond to some objective truth, there's no reason to think that your intuitions reflect any objective moral standard. However, this
Yeah. So the issue here, and I think he gives an example, or he explains why this sort of concern can be pressed against someone that shares a certain cluster of views about naturalism and natural selection and the evolution of human morality and that sort of thing. If there were different selective pressures, human morality could have ended up different. That would be the general idea here. And so, if you think that, uh, we have some sort of ability to access moral truth, but the psychological mechanisms associated with our moral intuitions or judgments or dispositions are contingent on specific features of our selective history that, were they different, could have resulted in radically different or even diametrically opposed moral values. uh, that could be a problem, because you might expect that, yeah, and you might predict that that would not have been the case for something like visual perception, or taste perception, or something like that. Because in those other cases, if humans weren't eating more nutritious foods and they were going around eating garbage or something, they wouldn't have survived. And so the taste capacities that we have, will, with respect to tracking foods that will sustain our life and allow us to avoid things that would be potentially harmful, they're pretty good at that. And with visual perception, the capacity to see things and accurately represent the world visually could be a product of natural selection. And um, it's not plausible that under different conditions our vision could have radically altered what, like, we could have seen more in the ultraviolet spectrum or infrared, or maybe we would use echolocation instead of vision. But the point would just be that our sensory capacities are generally going to furnish us with true or accurate information about the world around us, whatever the selective history might be, because it's adaptive to have true beliefs about the external world in that respect. And one could argue this is not the case for our moral standards or values, because they don't have to accurately represent anything in order to be, um, you know, favored by natural selection. So that would be the general idea here. And I don't see any particular reason to think that general narrative has got to be wrong. Some people that are realists may want to finesse that and say, no, no, no. It actually turns out, like, if you think morality is fundamentally, more natural selection favored, uh, those behavioral dispositions that would foster the development and construction of cooperative norms that would facilitate the minimization of conflict and the promotion of pro-social behavior. and you think that those are the moral truths, and natural selection favor those, then you might just think, no, actually, it doesn't have a problem. It is aligned with tracking the moral truths or something like that. So there are people that are going to try to make these sorts of moves. I don't find any of those particularly persuasive. Um, so sometimes it seems to me like they're looking at things with the benefit of hindsight and looking at the backwards and appealing to the fact that this is the way that they like things to be. Or there might be a variety of issues that I would have with people setting things up and construing them this way. At least one of them would just be that a lot of this looks to me very descriptive, and it looks to strip morality of a lot of the features that non-naturalists think that it would have to have in order to be practically relevant, and not just this trivial descriptive enterprise that we'd be engaged in. And I'm kind of inclined to agree with non-naturalists about that. A lot of these naturalist accounts of moral realism look to me like they want to, you know, give up all the stuff that would make moral realism distinctive and interesting and non-trivial. And instead, it just ends up being this sort of bland descriptive enterprise. Maybe some naturalists wouldn't agree with that characterization, and maybe some of them think that you could capture certain sorts of important normative or authoritative features of morality. That's a video for another day. All right, let's see what people have said. So Carlos Becerril says, I always dislike the point to say there's no reason evolution would select true beliefs over false ones is ridiculous. Well, it depends on the domain or context. You know, I you could frame this, take taste preferences. From a selective point of view, are we like tasting gastronomic? Like, is gastronomic realism is true, and then we like natural selection favored our capacity to detect these stance independent gastronomic facts? That seems really implausible. We could have turned out contingently to have some radically different diet, and then we would just like whatever that food was. So natural selection will work to shape our taste preferences so as to incline us to prefer foods that would be beneficial for us to eat, and to leave us disinclined to try to eat things that are not going to benefit our survival. And so in that sense, like, we're accurately tracking truths about what we can and can't eat via taste. So, or from a survival perspective. So I like drinking water and eating things that are high in calories, and I don't like I don't know, eating rusty nails and drinking gasoline. That sounds awful. And good thing for me. But how does it facilitate that? Well, the taste preferences motivate you to eat certain things and drink certain things, to not eat other things and not drink other sorts of things. Uh, and there are truths you're tracking. You're tracking indirectly truths about what is and isn't healthy to eat up to a point in certain contexts and that sort of thing. But you're not tracking the gastronomic truths. And so in the case of human morality, it may very well be that if we do have some sort of adaptation for making certain sorts of moral judgments, those moral judgments may be true, and they may be tracking truths about what sort of behaviors will lead to us leaving behind more offspring, but they don't have to be tracking stance independent moral truths. It's not clear how or why they would, like, how they would do that, why they would need to do that. Whatever behavior we're going to be disposed to favor on this perspective would be behavior that is going to enhance our reproductive fitness. So one could say, for instance, if it turned out that, killing some of your children or cannibalism or torturing people, if those turned out to provide some sort of selective advantage, we would have favored those. And so this sort of radical contingency of the moral values that we happen to have raises questions about whether those values are tracking some sort of truths that would be true independent of the sort of vagaries of our particular selective history, in ways that wouldn't be the case for something like visual perception or some other sort of sensory capacity, where we could expect, all sorts of different organisms under a variety of different selective conditions to converge on, to the extent that they employ a particular type of sensory capacity to detect the same sorts of things. If I'm outside, a dog and I can both see trees because we're accurately detecting where trees truly are. And so some sorts of capacities that we have, they're truth trackiness is what's adaptive about them. But the idea, Michael, this is unclear why that would be the case for morality. And so it would be different from those. So that would be the idea. All right. Yeah. Gabriel Chapel says, "Love your content, Lance. Can't wait for your second convo with Philofunculus." Yeah, we got to get into another one where we talk about morality. Oh, right. Nitty says, "How would an intuition to eat your children, let's say, always be selected for?" To all, I don't know to always eat your children. How could that be selected for? You could imagine really, really bizarre circumstances. So here would be one. Let's say that for whatever reason, from a selective perspective, let's say it's a species where children, when they're born, are pretty mobile and capable of protecting themselves or fleeing. Organisms like parents. So sorry, let's say we're dealing with species. So I don't have to say organism. So we're dealing with a species where parents that try to eat their children, it creates massive amounts of pressure for those children to flee or defend themselves. And the children of those parents that are inclined to attempt to eat their children are so much more badass. Like they're really good at fleeing, or so they're fast, or they're really good at fighting because they could fight off their parents, or they're really good at coordinating with one another. So they fight off their parents. It benefits their genes and they end up having more offspring. And so those children, because they carry the parents' genes, are also inclined to eat their own children, or to attempt. Well, sorry, they're inclined to eat their children, but it could be that it's selective for them to try to eat their children. But the benefits to the children that survive this process are so great that they have a more of a selective advantage over the children of parents that don't attempt to eat them. So, you have these two strategies. One is, on average, you have one or two kids and then you eat 10 of them. And the other parents, they don't eat any of the 10 kids. But the parents that tend to do that tend to have children that are not, they don't have as much of a fitness advantage in the environment in question. So the parents sort of just cull the children in one context and not in the other. And so it's actually advantageous for them to do that. So that would be one way of achieving something like that. So it would be a question of whether the culling, whether the benefits of the culling process are so great that there's some sort of advantage. It could also be that the process of attempting to eat your children causes some sort of change in the children. Maybe you could imagine really weird physiologies where it releases so much stress hormone that they grow super fast, and there's an advantage to that. And so attempting to eat your children actually accelerates their development, and that gives them some sort of massive reproductive advantage over conspecifics or something. So there are these are all just don't get me wrong; these are like super duper contrived. Uh, there may be species that engage in certain sorts of cannibalism within the species and that sort of thing. I don't know if those like praying mantises and stuff don't spiders. Some of them eat like mates and stuff like that. I don't know how much of that is a product of uh, like how much of that is an adaptation and how much of that is a byproduct of certain sorts of adaptations. I don't really know. But it doesn't it like you could imagine really contrived scenarios that could get some really weird proposed adaptation off the ground. All right. Yeah, and Nitty, if you mean like successfully always eating all of their offspring, I don't I don't know how that could be selected for, because how would the genes get in the next generation? That wouldn't I don't see how that would work. All right. Still looking through the chat. The title is strange. I've noticed Lance having weird views. This is from Indo. So the title of the video is "Can atheists have moral knowledge?" No, nobody can. Well, I took moral knowledge in this video to mean knowledge of stance independent moral truths. Since I don't think there are any of those, I don't think atheists can have knowledge of them any more than I think atheists can have knowledge of like unicorn cupcake preferences. Like, do unicorns like sprinkles or not? We can't have knowledge of that because there are no unicorns. So, and of course, nobody can because there are no unicorns. So that's the same sort of vibe that I'm trying to give off here. Endo asks, I've heard you say that deductive arguments are vacuous, rubbish, or don't exist. Well, I wouldn't say they're rubbish. I do think that there's a certain sense in which they are vacuous. So I think all deductive arguments are question begging. That doesn't mean I think that they're useless. So, logic can be used to regiment and organize one's thinking and get clear on what one means by certain sorts of terms, to expose contradictions in other people's views, and to identify contradictions in one's own views. All of those are really useful things. So logic is just very, very valuable. I just think that it has certain sorts of applications that it's useful for and certain sorts of applications that it's not so useful for. I don't think deductive arguments are like dialectical pushers. They don't move the dialectic along by demonstrating something that a person that doesn't already accept the conclusion go, oh no, I didn't realize that. Unless you find some contradiction in the views that the person has. So and it's useful for that. So they're not going to compel people that don't already, if a person has a clear and consistent set of views and you present a deductive syllogism in favor of some position you hold, the person's going to reject one of the premises at least. So it's not going to work very well. So they lack the kind of dialectical force that they're often employed towards, as if they have that force, and they just don't. That does not mean that they're rubbish, and it does not mean that they're useless, and it does not mean that I'm against philosophers employing logic. I just think that people misuse logic. They use logic in contexts where it's presented as a kind of rhetorical sledgehammer to bludgeon other people over the head, or it's presented as a challenge, like, look, I've got the syllogism and I win unless you could beat my syllogism. And so it's used in ways that I think are misuses of logic. So to say that there are ways of misusing logic isn't to say that logic doesn't have uses, like legitimate ones. And anyway, do I still hold that view? Yes, I do. All right. Blamtastical says, are we bashing the psychophysical harmony argument too? Sweet. No, not in this video. Does that? I don't even think that comes up. Well, I don't even know if I finished watching the whole video. All right, let's keep going. I think I got caught up. Yeah. Endo says, "Oh, your view on deductive arguments is like Grandmoppy. It makes sense when you explain it." Yeah. Okay. I've heard people say it's like Grandmoppy, but I don't know what Grandmoppy says about this. So I'll take your word for it because you're like the fourth or fifth person to say something like that.
This presents a problem. Knowledge is typically understood as something resembling justified true belief or warranted true belief. Put simply, most epistemologists think that in order to know a proposition, you have to believe the proposition. The proposition has to be true, and you have to have some type of justification for its truth. Just getting lucky with the belief being true is not enough. You need some reason, some evidence, some justification for thinking that the belief is true. Additionally, whatever justification I have for a belief, that justification can be defeated. Justification can be defeated when some piece of information arises that undercuts the nature of the justification. Here's a famous example. Suppose you are driving through a country and you see what looks like barns from
You're
the
getting a
road.
Gettier
You
problem
come
here.
to believe that there's a barn in the field based on this experience. That's your justification. However, suppose you learn later that the residents of this area craft extremely realistic looking facades of barns to trick drivers who are going by on the road. Once you learn this information, you have an undercutting defeater for your belief about seeing a barn in the field. I hope now that you can see the problem. It seems like evolution and naturalism give us a defeater for all of our moral intuitions, since we know the development of our moral intuitions has nothing to do with truth. If justification is an essential ingredient for knowledge, and all of problem for the atheists who so desperately want to sling moral accusations at God. They can't even account for the moral knowledge they so desperately want to use. Now, all you atheists who are out there watching this, I know what response you want to give. You want to say that our moral intuitions are justified because true intuitions are more likely to help with survival. If you say this, I'm going to hit you with the hard counter. I'm going to smile and say that if that is really the case, well, then we should all be theists. Belief in the supernatural is a widespread, innate metaphysical intuition held by humanity.
A metaphysical intuition, that's a little ambiguous. I mean, is the intuition itself metaphysical, or is it an intuition about the metaphysical? Presumably, they mean the latter of the two, because the former would be a little silly. Um, but anyway, let's take
I
this
hope
back a
you,
bit.
if that is really the case, well, then we should all be theists. Belief in the supernatural is a widespread, innate metaphysical intuition held by humanity. I hope you can see the issue at play here. Humanity, as a species, has this widespread belief or intuition about the existence of God and the supernatural. So if you tell me that we should just trust all of the intuitions that evolution has given us because, evolution is more likely to select for true intuitions than false ones, then I'm going to say by that same logic, all the theists in the world, which is, most people, they are justified in trusting their intuitions about.
Yeah, so there's something I'll say like where I think that there's a good point in here, but I do think that there's a weakness in here, which is that the person that thinks that like a truth tracking capacity, like where for our moral judgments, like they actually are tracking truths, they don't have to think we should just trust our intuitions. They they could approach this in some sort of roundabout fashion where, they could argue that something about the kinds of truths that moral judgments furnish us with allows them to be truth tracking. Or they could argue that there's an absence of defeaters. They could argue for something that would be both true of religious intuitions and moral intuitions, but that there's defeaters in the case of the religious intuitions, but not in the case of the moral ones. So we might sort of at first glance accept both, but then we have some reason for rejecting the religious ones and not the moral ones. So there's a variety of strategies that they could employ for saying, hey, there could be some general trust that we put in our intuitions, and then, our moral judgments are insulated from defeaters that take down other ones. And so I could get around the sort of religious objection, or they could point to some sort of a symmetry breaker where they could say that there's something about the way in which we think about morality. I'm not going to like sketch specifics. I don't even think I could if I tried. But they could, in principle, say that there's something about the way we acquire moral knowledge or think about morality that gives us access to it in a way that our religious judgments don't, or religious intuitions don't. They could, in principle, argue about the empirical details here. So they could argue that it's actually the case that we do have a universal shared evolved predisposition for engaging in moral cognition, or morality is a product or is an adaptation or something like that, but that religious beliefs aren't. So they could challenge the empirical claims here. So I think he's underselling the number of strategies. Again, I don't actually endorse realism, so I'm not, I don't even endorse the arguments that I'm suggesting one could make here. But my point here is simply that there are a variety of moves that would be available to the naturalist, atheist, realist that wants to preserve morality and doesn't want to accept this sort of comparison. This here is maybe an attempt at something like a reductio, or it's an attempt to say, look, you're an atheist if you're going to accept that so the idea might be something like this: hey, we should trust our intuitions. They track truth, and they track truth in the case of morality, so we can believe in objective moral truth. But hey, there's a problem, because we also have these divine intuitions. We have these intuitions that there's a god, or we have intuitions that there's some sort of teleology in the world that's best explained by positing a designer of the world, and it would make sense to call that designer God. So if we're going to trust the one, and we should also trust the other, and so now you're stuck. If you're going to accept that moral realism is true, you'd also have to accept that there's a God, but you're an atheist, so there's an inconsistency. So you're going to have to resolve that. You're going to have to either reject both or accept that God exists, and now you're not an atheist anymore. So that seems to be the general strategy here. Now, what could we say as far as that one of those strategies that I suggested, that they could sort of try to argue against the empirical basis for the claims that are going to be made here? The issue is that I just agree with them that it does appear to me that humans probably do have certain sorts of evolved predispositions for, if not believing in God, then having a predisposition. People have like apophenia, pareidolia. So we have various sorts of evolved predispositions to detect agencies where there may be nothing physically present. So I think, what is it called? A hyperactive agency detection device. That's like something that came out of evolutionary psychology. I don't buy a lot of the like super duper modular stuff that might be proposed from evolutionary psychologists, but the idea that we have kind of a skewed bias towards detecting agencies where none exist, or that we have a predisposition to see design or designoid features in the things around us, or to think in terms of teleology or purposefulness of otherwise, presumptively inanimate things from a naturalist or secular perspective. We may very well exhibit all of those capacities, and it may very well be that there were selective advantages for believing in God or gods or the supernatural, or to be superstitious, or to believe in supernatural, divine, or transcendent sorts of things. Any one of these things, or in any combination, may be a product of some selective input from natural selection. And if that's the case, and I suspect that in other words, like if you look all over the world, you see religion in most places. There are a few societies, I believe the Piraha, I don't think that they have religion. And so it may very well be that culture can override it if it's present, but that it's a sort of a otherwise a pretty generally universal emerging sort of thing. Again, though, as I said, it can be hard to establish that something is a direct product of innate psychological predispositions, because it could be that certain aspects about human societies or the environments that we're in dispose us towards developing some sort of religious beliefs, and that it really isn't a product of our shared biological evolution. It could be a product of shared environment, shared culture. It's a possibility, but I don't think that it is. I suspect that there is something about our shared evolutionary history that inclines us towards some sort of religious and supernatural beliefs. I think, if societies were wiped out, civilization and history were wiped out, I think humans would reinvent religions. They wouldn't be the identical ones, I don't think, but I think people would reinvent religions of some kind, and they would reinvent a belief in the supernatural. Would they reinvent morality? Well, it depends what we mean by morality. But if what we mean by morality is the sort of a culturally distinctive thing that I tend to mean by that, then no, I don't think that it would reemerge. But I think religion would. So, if anything, I actually think that the case for an evolved capacity for religiosity is probably stronger than the case for an evolved capacity for morality. I think the latter is more likely to be entirely or primarily a product of cultural evolution rather than biological evolution relative to religiosity. So, in other words, I think that to the extent that they're trying to say, "Hey, look, if you're going to just accept whatever we have an evolved predisposition to believe in, if you're going to accept that for morality, you might want to reconsider because you might have to also accept that for religiosity." I think there's some force to that. So, okay.
About God, and you can't object to them and call them silly. In fact, there is evidence which suggests that even hardcore atheists, outspoken atheists, intuitively see some type of design or teleology behind the universe, and that therefore they also should believe in God because these intuitions were given to them by evolution. Here's a short clip from a previous video I made in which I discuss some of these studies.
As much as it might irritate our atheist friends to hear it, there are some studies which indicate that atheists do, in fact, deep down know that God exists. For instance,
So that's going to be a problem. So if you have some evolved predisposition to think a certain way or have a certain inclination or disposition, uh, you can override it. If we have an evolved predisposition to detect teleology in the world, and it's a product of natural selection, and that's how our brains are built. And in other words, your sort of reflexive reaction to the world is to think there's design here, or there's purpose here, or there are gods behind this, or there are spirits driving things. You can override and reject that. The fact that you could nevertheless detect traces of that evolved capacity does not mean that you know deep down that there is a God or anything like that. Just because you have that sort of residual inclination towards thinking in those terms doesn't mean on reflection that you endorse that. So, a person could have all sorts of, like, let's say I don't really, this doesn't have to be hypothetical, but a person could not believe in ghosts. They could still get a little anxious in a haunted house, or if they hear creaking boards, they might worry. Oh, their initial reaction, there's somebody there, and they go, okay, no, there's nobody there. Calm down. So you can have an inclination to or natural disposition to have a certain reaction or tendency to believe something that you subsequently override. The presence of that disposition doesn't mean that deep down you actually believe that, and not the thing that you say that you believe. So I think that's reading too much into the empirical literature on this, and it's overstating what this evidence can show.
this study asked religious and non-religious participants to dare God to hurt them or their family. And despite atheists rating these statements as less unpleasant than religious individuals, when they were asked to actually say these statements, the atheists showed an emotional arousal that was comparable to the religious individuals. The study also had the participants say the same statements about God, but instead of having them dare God to do something, they just said they wished it to happen. Both atheists and religious distress when daring God to do something than when merely saying they wished it would happen. Atheists also refused to say aloud the God statements, and they felt the need to undo the statements equally often as religious individuals did. There was also this study which showed that when
Yeah, so none of that is shows that people deep down believe in God, especially for atheists that grow up in a religious society and a culture. So there's a bunch of like the question would be, why are they doing this? So, if former Catholics will often talk about how they continue to feel a sense of guilt about performing activities that they no longer think are immoral, like masturbating or something like that. Even if you no longer believe something, that it can still leave emotional scars on you or traces of it, residual influences of that thing can linger with you even if you don't believe it. So let's say, someone decided to pull a really horrible prank and give you a call and say like your best friend or your spouse or your child died. Oh, they were in a terrible accident and they died. And you could feel that sense of horror, your bottom drops out of you're just like you can't handle it, and then they say, just kidding. That's not even a prank. That's just cruel. But do your emotions immediately do they just align back with your beliefs? Oh, okay, so that didn't happen. So now I'm fine. No, you're still going to be angry and upset and emotionally distraught. Like there's still going to be a residual impact of those influences on you. And if you have certain sorts of experiences, even if you no longer believe it, if someone told you your whole life you're ugly or you're stupid or you're a bad person, and you no longer believe that, you can still be a little sensitive if someone says something like that. You could still sometimes feel like, oh, what if it is true? But no, I don't believe it. So uh, the way that things impact us emotionally doesn't give some insight into like our secret beliefs. Things can impact us emotionally, even if we don't believe it. The other thing there is like signaling and stuff like that. So, even if you no longer believe in God, you may be concerned about publicly saying things that are critical of God because of reputational or social consequences that might come from that. That could be a factor. There are ways you could try to get around that, but it could also just be, you know, you could think something like, even though I don't believe this, there's a small chance. Don't I? I might want to hedge my bets. That's the closest you might get, I think, plausibly to the person still believes, but that's not really believing. A person. Is it surprising if an atheist doesn't want to participate in a satanic ritual or something? I don't think so. They might just be really uncomfortable. That what about on the off chance? That doesn't mean you secretly believe in the thing in question, or that deep down you believe. It just could be that there's some residual influence of either one, like epistemic hedge, or the possibility that it's true, or two, a sort of emotional influence that it's hard to fully suppress. So there's all sorts of ways that these people that are described in these studies could be influenced that do not speak to them being like secret believers or something like that.
when given pictures of nature and asked if it was made by a being, atheists, even those involved in atheist organizations, were more likely to respond that the nature was made by a being when they were not given time to censor their thoughts. This seems to indicate that even atheists reflectively and intuitively recognize teleology and nature.
That's not reflectively. That would be unreflectively. I think he said reflectively. So if you put people under time constraint or cognitive load or something like that, it may very well be that people default towards attributing design or teleology to things, and that they have to reflectively override this. This does not mean that the disposition to do this, that the fact that it's some sort of intuitive or automatic thing that we do, means that we secretly or truly believe that, and we don't believe the things that we endorse on reflection or with focused effort to suppress. I can see why one might think that. One might think, well, okay, so you have this intuition, this gut reaction to things, and then you have to sort of tamp it down, override it. And so the gut reaction, that's the true feeling that you have, not the override. So you could think, you see a person like, oh, I hate that person. No. I have to be nice. Maybe they're a good person. Don't judge people by your initial vibes that you give off bad vibes. You got to suppress that. So you might think, nah, you don't like the person. And there might be contexts in which that's true. But in this case, it's really going to depend on the cognitive processes in question. So, let's say that I'll give an example like some sort of safety thing, like those saws that if you touch them, they stop and they don't continue to cut you. Uh, does that mean a person's going to be able to just poke them with no problem? No, you might still have this reluctance. Another case of this would be walking over a glass bridge over like where is it, in the Grand Canyon or something? Or there's various glass bridges in different parts of the world. You could genuinely believe it is safe. You're not going to fall to your doom. Uh, but you might nevertheless have severe anxiety. And there's a part of you that's like, no, you're going to die. This is scary. This is dangerous. So uh, just because certain features of our psychology, certain cognitive processes will push us towards certain attitudes, feelings, dispositions, or beliefs, and we could override them, doesn't mean that those processes are the true ones that reflect our true self or our true beliefs, and that the sort of effortful top-down uh, methods that we take to suppress that, those are somehow artificial or fake or not real. I think he's implying something contrary to this there, and I think that that's wrong. And I don't think that this is showing that atheists are like secret theists. I don't think that's really necessary for the point, though. The point would just be people are intuitively inclined to have supernatural religious or spiritual beliefs of some kind. And that I think is true. I just don't think that people that override or suppress those are somehow being insincere or not acknowledging what they truly believe or something.
Even though they are going to fill my comment section saying they don't. There are a lot of studies similar to these that show similar results. In fact, some researchers in this field have gone so far as to suggest that atheism is only skin deep. In this paper, the researcher describes a study in which he observed atheists regularly attributing a teleology to their lives despite their supposed non-beliefs. And he says, I think
For the record, applying teleology to things does not make you a theist. You could think that there's like non-gods that are involved in purpose and design in the world, like a principle. But just the point is, just because you have an innate predisposition to have that sort of reaction doesn't mean that you genuinely believe it. Take something like pareidolia. So if I show you, in fact, let me yeah, let me do it. Let me do it. Let me get a good example here. Ooh, I like that one. I don't want to share the whole thing though. So if you look up something like pareidolia, you could see that I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's very easy for us to see faces in inanimate objects. Now, when I'm looking at a bunch of these images, if you Google it, you'll see a bunch of them yourself. Now, I see them very, very easily all over the place. These faces all over the place. Uh, does that mean I believe that these faces are actual faces? No. So just because I have something about the way human visual processing works, we are really prone to seeing faces even where there's no actual face, doesn't mean that deep down we truly believe that there's all these faces and that like all these like rocks and trees and burnt toast, that there's all these like sentient beings embedded in them and spirits and gods are all over the place in the world around us. Not at all. And so, just because we have a predisposition, if it's in fact the case, to attribute purpose, design, or teleology to things, doesn't mean that we secretly believe in God. We could have just evolved to do that by default. Maybe it's selectively advantageous to operate with various sorts of heuristics that presuppose design or purpose or intent. It's useful to do that. But that doesn't mean we have to believe it just because we have that capacity.
quite rightly that, quote, this pattern of thinking strongly implies that atheism is more a verbal muzzling of God, a conscious executively made decision. Quite rightly that, quote, this pattern of thinking strongly implies that atheism is more a verbal muzzling of God, a conscious executively made decision to reject one's own intuitions about a faceless uber mind involved in our personal affairs than it is a true cognitive exorcism, end quote.
So
Yeah, I don't buy the characterization. It doesn't. I don't would have to look at more of their data, but I doubt that it's strongly implied. The implication here seems to be that people are just saying they're atheists, but they're not really atheists. I don't think the data shows that. And I don't, nothing that was presented here would make a good case for that.
So, atheist, if you are watching this, you need to be very careful how you respond. If you want to sling moral accusations at God and the Bible, you have to account for that moral knowledge under your worldview. And you have to do that in a way that doesn't also set up the easy counter argument I just mentioned. And here's the thing, I actually don't think that you guys can do this.
Okay, so we could close that out. One moment. All right, and I'll have to get caught up with the chat. One second. All right. Okay. What was that? Okay, cool. Alrighty. So that finishes things up for the video. Now I had wanted to talk about this Mashry and Malin paper, and I really like this paper. It's just called The Evolution of Morality. I think the editor is John Doris. Let me look it up. Yeah, Handbook of Moral Psychology. Yeah, John Doris and the Moral Psychology Research Group. Oh, it's called the Moral Psychology Handbook. Okay, that's the name. And it's the first chapter. It's called Evolution of Morality. The authors are Ron Malin and Edouard Mashry. And what they argue there is that when people say that morality evolved, this is an ambiguous remark, and you can disambiguate it in a number of ways. And so in the chapter, they go through 3 different ways that that remark is disambiguated. So let's go through those. Let me have a drink first. Okay, so the first way is to say that some of the psychological components involved in human morality, those are a product of natural selection. Okay, well, that's very likely to be true. But what they point out is that it would be difficult in any particular case to determine like what exactly is a product of natural selection, what's a byproduct, and how and why and in what respect it's involved in moral cognition. So this could include things like emotions, and other sorts of things are clearly involved in moral judgment. So like memory is involved in moral judgment. You have to keep track of the people that did good stuff and bad stuff and who you can trust and who you can't trust. But those psychological capacities, emotion, memory, perception, those psychological processes, are those specifically adaptations for engaging in moral judgment? No, it's just that they could be leveraged to engage in moral judgment. The same sorts of capacities would be involved, memory and perception and those sorts of things, emotion, in cooking, in playing a game, in doing all sorts of things. And so clearly, some of the psychological components involved in moral judgment, they may very well be the product of natural selection. Okay, but that doesn't tell us a whole lot about whether morality itself evolved any more than it would tell us about anything else that could, be a product of culture or something else evolved, so to speak. So, one way of disambiguating this would be to just say, yeah, look, there's stuff about human psychology that's involved in moral judgment. Okay, well, that's not especially informative. So we could look at the next one, that a capacity for engaging in normative cognition evolved. So thinking in terms of like deontic structures and making evaluative claims. So not just thinking in terms of descriptive things, but in terms of saying that things are good or bad, right or wrong, obligatory, permissible, impermissible. That a capacity for thinking in those terms and devising and employing normative judgments and evaluations, that could be a product of natural selection. And they argue, yeah, there's some evidence for that, and that's a pretty reasonable thing to think that people have the ability to do, and that it is a product of natural selection. But no, that doesn't tell us whether a distinctively moral aspect of normative cognition evolved. That would be kind of open-ended. We have epistemic norms, we have social conventional norms, we have prudential norms. So there are a variety of ways of thinking in normative terms that are not exclusive to morality or distinctively moral. And so then they turn their attention to this final claim that morality as a distinctive form of normative cognition, that is a product of natural selection. And what they argue is there actually isn't particularly good empirical evidence for that. And they give an example of Richard Joyce. He has a book called Evolution of Morality. He's also an error theorist, an anti-realist, which is pretty cool. But he also has this book called Evolution of Morality, where he has this rather robust account of what this evolved capacity for distinctively moral cognition, that is a product of natural selection, that we have an adaptation for specifically thinking in moral terms. And he clarifies, I'm not going to get into the details here, of what that involves. And the question would be, is there good empirical evidence that we have such a capacity? And they argue that the answer is no, not really. So there are a variety of ways one could try to sort of track down empirical evidence that people have this shared capacity for thinking in moral terms. So what would that look like? Well, one of the ways I like to illustrate what this would look like in principle is to point to a really well-established and fairly clear empirical paradigm that was and probably still is used in moral psychology, the moral conventional distinction. So you might be thinking, well, what would it mean to have a distinctive capacity for moral cognition? What that would mean is that we would have a shared capacity wherever you are in the world. You don't have to learn to think in these terms, but that you sort of automatically, or you're innately predisposed to think in these terms. You'd have to have some capacity for making judgments that we would call, these are the moral judgments, and these other judgments about these other normative concerns, these are not moral judgments. There would have to be some shared set of meta-normative characteristics that the moral judgments have in common that these other sorts of judgments don't. There need to be some distinguishing features to them. And so the moral conventional distinction is one empirical paradigm that was devised in an effort to identify this, distinctive capacity for moral cognition. Now, I should note that the proponents of the moral conventional distinction didn't necessarily have to argue that it was an innate capacity or that it was a product of natural selection. Could be a product of cultural learning. But nevertheless, you could culturally learn to engage in it in this sort of distinction. So whether it's a product of natural selection or it's culturally acquired, you could still talk about, hey, what is this distinction? How does it work? And nevertheless, it still illustrates what an evolved capacity for distinctively moral cognition could look like. So here's what they did. What they did is studies were mostly conducted with children, and they would give them a various types of normative transgressions. So this would be stuff like pulling hair, hitting somebody else, refusing to share your toys, all the sorts of things that would make sense to children as transgressions. And then stuff like wearing pajamas in class, or not taking a nap during nap time, or doing other sorts of things that would break, like writing with a wrong kind of crayon. I don't know exactly what they would be, but they would be things that you'll note in the first set of things that I described. You might think, oh yeah, those are the moral ones. And the second set of things I described, it's like, okay, well, those are like class rules, but they're not really like moral rules. And if that was your reaction, okay, you will probably already draw the moral conventional distinction with what they call the moral conventional task. And the way that works is you take all these transgressions, and you have a sort of a priori classification. Those first ones, hitting, pulling hair, refusing to share toys, we're going to conceptualize those. We're going to say those look like to us like the moral norms. And then these other things like wearing pajamas in class and not taking a nap during nap time, those are social conventional violations. Eating lunch with your hands, or something like eating noodles with your hands. That might be a violation of a social, but it's not a moral, right? So then the question would be, if you ask various questions about these transgressions to children, will they reliably attribute a cluster of characteristics to the moral norms that they won't attribute to the social conventional norms? And if so, if their responses match your a priori pattern, the sort of like, okay, we've got this box over here, these are the moral ones, and we've got this box over here, here's the social conventions. If children reliably attribute all the same properties to stuff in your moral box, and they don't attribute those same properties to the stuff in the social conventional box, it looks like children are drawing the distinction without you having to spell it out or tell them this. They just do it. They did. So what questions did they ask the children? Well, they asked them stuff like, would children in another school far, far away, would they be subject to this rule? And for the moral violations, children would say, yes, they would have to follow the rule. But for the other stuff like, eating noodles with your hands, they might say no at higher rates. And so they would not attribute this sort of a universality to the social conventions, but they would attribute it to the moral rules. So you could call that generalizability. Do the moral rules apply to everybody else? Sorry, I should say, do the normative rules apply to everybody else? The a prioristically selected moral violations, children did on average tend to say those are generalizable. The social conventions, they did not consider generalizable. So generalizability. Second one, authority, dependence, or independence. Children thought that the moral rules could not be overridden by authorities. If the teacher said it's okay, it's still not okay. But for the social conventions, they did think that they could be overridden. And then last, they would ask children why, and children would say things like, because it hurts people or it's unfair or something. For the moral violations, they would not tend to say those things. For the other sorts of violations, there was a fourth characteristic, which is seriousness. And I've seen other controls where there's slightly different types of independence. It's not super important for the purposes of what I'm saying here. But they would also ask about severity. But that didn't seem to reliably replicate, so they dropped that as a characteristic. So you really have these three characteristics that reliably emerged, which is that the paradigmatic moral norms would be considered generalizable, authority independent, and justified in terms of harm, rights, and fairness, and social conventions wouldn't be. And so they tested this with children. Even children like 3 years old would draw, and they do so all over the place, and this replicates. So kids tend to do this a lot. Now, subsequent research showed that there are cultures and communities you could find where children do not draw this distinction. They kind of lump everything into the moral, like they treat everything as having the characteristics that these other children attributed just to morality. There are other complications too. So somewhat older children and adults, you could give them more complicated stuff, and you could sort of blur the lines between the two clusters so that it's no longer clear that you really have this discrete division and the properties sort of come apart. So you could get kids that will attribute one of these properties to some violations, but not the other two, that sort of thing. So does that mean that the original studies are wrong? No, it just means that this may not be a universal capacity and it may not apply to all norms. But the point there is just that that could be leveraged, and some people have leveraged it as evidence of an innate capacity for engaging in a distinctive type of normative cognition, moral cognition. And so you might say, okay, people have an evolved predisposition to think that a certain cluster of activities or things that people might do, certain sorts of transgressions, that those are a product of natural selection. That the capacity to distinguish things in that way and to draw that sort of distinction. So you and I and people all over the world, just as it's just right in our brains that at some point in our development we start thinking, hey, that's wrong in a way where it doesn't matter if authority figures say otherwise, it's still wrong. And everybody should follow this rule. And it's unfair. It's unjust. It's harmful. Shouldn't do it. It's bad. And so if that sort of capacity, if you found that in every culture and it emerged even in the absence of any sort of cultural learning, one could argue, okay, well, that sure looks like what we mean in philosophy when we're talking about morality. It looks pretty darn similar. Now, there are some shortcomings to this. Some of them are methodological, and some of them are just the lack of actually detecting this everywhere. But the other one is like, for instance, this focuses exclusively on transgressions, and it doesn't focus on like positive moral behavior or supererogatory action or that sort of thing. So that would be one issue. What other sorts of issues are there? Other sorts of issues would be that the way in which you go about, you have these like stimulus sampling issues. So how representative are the stimuli that you use for these studies of the respective domains that they're supposed to represent? That's unclear. Typically, the way that the statistical analyses of these studies model these effects is they take the stimuli that's used and they treat them as what I have this mixed up now. But basically, they treat them presumptively as if they are representative of the respective domains from which they're drawn, without us actually knowing whether they're representative. Right. So they treat them as random effects when in fact they are fixed effects. And so what I mean by that is, suppose I went around and I wanted to know, and this is a sort of example I give for illustrating the issue in like, simple and straightforward terms, because, there are statistical complications to this that I don't really fully grasp. And so I think that the more intuitive ways of grasping what's at stake with these stimulus sampling issues are a good way of conveying it. And it's the only way I really understand of doing so. But take like a survey. If I wanted to find out, do people like fruit? And so, fruit, okay, there's lots of different types of fruit. What if I went around just asking people, do you like durian or do you like pineapple? Well, pineapple's a bit polarizing. It's very acidic. Some people don't like it. It's too astringent. And so if I went around asking people about pineapple or honeydew or kiwis in particular, let's say I did a survey. Do you like pineapple, honeydew, and kiwis? Rate how much you like these on a 7-point scale. Whatever values people give, would that be representative of their attitudes towards fruit? Let's say the person says, I don't really like pineapple. I don't really like kiwi very much. Do we conclude, okay, well, the person doesn't really like fruit? No, because other person's like, well, I don't like those, but I love grapes and apples and pears and peaches. So are pineapple and kiwi representative of fruit? I don't know, maybe. And so the same sort of methodological issue can arise in empirical research when you're picking, for instance, moral stimuli. If you choose hitting someone, shoving someone, pulling someone's hair, is that representative of moral transgressions? Well, it's a very narrow slice of moral transgressions. How representative is it of the quote unquote moral domain as a whole, whatever the putative moral domain is supposed to be? Well, you could treat them as if they were randomly selected and like a representative sampling of the pool of possible moral issues, but are they? Because was the way in which you went about selecting that stimuli random? Did you get the entire population of moral issues and then randomly select, the three moral issues? No, you didn't do that. You made them up. You crafted them. And so they're not, it'd be like if I went around and I'm like, I want you, and you to participate in my psychological research study. Well, did you randomly sample the population? No, because you chose the people to participate in your study. That's not random selection. And so, we all know it's important if you're running an experiment to randomly assign people to a particular condition. And we all know if you're gathering participants for some correlational study, you're not even randomizing them. If you want the participants that are participating in your study to represent the population that you draw them from, you got to do your best. In practice, it's impossible to perfectly replicate genuine randomness, but you got to do your best to gather a sample that isn't like self-selected, like it's just your friends or it's just people you think will give the answer you want or something like that. You can't do that, or you're going to get all sorts of selection effects and biases that skew your results to where your sample no longer represents the population it's drawn from. And so you can't now generalize from whatever findings you find among your sample to the population that the sample is supposed to represent. And the same thing technically applies to stimuli. So if you're employing moral stimuli and you don't randomly select this moral stimuli, and you can't randomly select the moral stimuli, what are you going to do then? Well, you're making certain assumptions about the representativeness of the stimuli that you're employing that may not be true. And so it's possible that if we chose a different set of stimuli than the stimuli that's chosen for the moral conventional task, that we would get a different set of results. I hope that's clear from my way of conveying it. There's sort of there are ways around this. So you could use like multi-level modeling and certain sorts of statistical techniques that can attempt to mitigate the problem of the problems that arise from treating data one way when it's not technically that way. And there's all sorts of other ways that we do this, like technically, like Likert scales. That's not interval or ratio. It's not like the difference between choosing a 1 and a 2 on a 7-point scale of like how much you like pizza is identical to choosing a 3 instead of a 2. So is the difference between choosing a 1 and a 2 identical to the difference between a 2 and a 3? No. What would that even mean? These aren't like real numbers represent. It's not like in your brain there's like my like of pizza is at a 92 and yours is an 84 or something like that. And so there's an actual numeric value that maps onto like real features of the world. No, these numbers are like metaphorical. They're symbolic. They're representative of some underlying judgment calls that vary from one individual to another and don't map onto like real metrics. They're not like centimeters or grams or something like that. So, but nevertheless, if you look at the way that people crunch the numbers when they use Likert scales, is they treat them as if these are real differences between the values and that they're proportionate and not that they're just an ordinal ranking of values. As far as I know, people that have looked at does this matter when it comes to statistical analysis, the answer appears to be from what little I've seen of this, not really. It doesn't matter that much. You could get by treating one set of values as another. But in the case of stimulus sampling, it's like it actually is a problem because if you use really unrepresentative stimuli, you may reach conclusions that aren't warranted. Anyway, so that would be one potential issue with this. But the bottom line is these findings are just not found in all cultures all over the place. So that as a candidate for something that you would say is an innate capacity, the moral conventional distinction is not going to cut it. So then the question would be, is there any other research that shows that we all share this capacity for thinking in distinctively moral terms? And I don't think that there is. There might be. I don't specialize in the study of the evolution of human moral cognition, but I've read a few papers on this. There's not a ton of research on this, but there's some, and there's probably quite a bit I don't know about. So this is something people are still arguing about. There's moral nativists that say, yeah, there's evidence of this. There's people that are anti-nativists that argue against this. This is an ongoing thing. I don't know where the current state of the literature is at, but my current take from what I know is there's not really compelling or decisive evidence that we all share this capacity for engaging in distinctively moral cognition. Now, There are some pretty trivial ways of saying everybody has morality, and that's to use some sort of operational definition that would apply to everybody. So you could say, okay, well, by moral system, I just mean a system of norms and institutions that facilitate pro-social behavior within social groups. Now, do all human societies have those? Absolutely. Every society that we've ever found has some sort of norms for facilitating cooperation within a group. If that's what you mean by morality, then yeah, all human societies have morality. But if you're looking for there being some special type of judgment that everybody engages in all cultures that share certain common characteristics, it's not so clear that that's the case. It's not even clear all societies have like cognate terms that map on to Western conceptions of morality. So I'm not convinced that everybody everywhere has morality or that it's a direct product of natural selection. But maybe future research will show that it is. Okay, so that's all I have to say about that. So let me look at the chat, and I think we'll wrap things up there. Okay. I don't know how long I was talking there, but it's also very cold. I think it was -24 here or something the other day. What's the temperature now? Let's see. -5 and 22 Fahrenheit. So pretty cold, pretty cold. It's not as bad as it was earlier. Okay, so let's have a look at the chat. People talking to each other, people arguing. Modern Moralist says, "Do you still love me?" Are you talking to me? You got more people trying to get people to like my videos. Sapir says, "Hardcore atheists have intuitions to click like on Lance content." Appreciate it. Appreciate it. All right. Oh, I think I might have read some of these. So Lat Deer says, "Yeah, I'm a disbeliever, formerly part of religion. There's some part of belief system that is left as a superstition to me, but as time passes, this diminishes." Right. So, I'm not convinced that we have this sort of innate thing. Now, note that they were describing. Sorry, I shouldn't have said I'm not convinced we have this innate thing. I'm not convinced that to the extent that we have some innate predisposition to think in religious terms, that this is an indication that we're like secretly religious. The other thing though is that if the people being tested are people that are formerly religious or that grow up in religious cultures, that could be influencing them. So if we looked at a society of people that for generations have not had religious beliefs, would they have this sort of innate reflexive reaction to, or would they think in teleological terms? I don't know. Has people tested that? It wouldn't surprise me if they did have these traits or capacities, but who knows? Oh wow, that's it. Caught up. People aren't saying so. People haven't said anything for like 20 minutes. What happened? Yeah, Carlos says the disposition to see faces from patterns and shapes may have been an evolutionary advantage that would have helped pick out camouflage organisms as well as hard to see hiding things. Yeah, so and this is why even perception isn't necessarily going to furnish us with entirely like true or accurate depiction of the world. It could overcorrect and make us sensitive to being like basically hyper responsive to potentially threatening stimuli in ways that don't accurately represent the world. It's like our perception is extra cautious. And so, that ability to detect faces will let us be just that, like to basically have it overtuned to where we're super sensitive to it. It'll misfire, but think about and this is the rationale that with like the evolutionary psychological rationale. Take it for what it's worth. It's the rationale sounds plausible. Does that mean it's actually the case when applied to human behavior? No. So here's the rationale for that. It's an asymmetry in cost. So let's say you're over dialed to where you're extra sensitive to detecting faces. So what this means is that you'll get more false positives. You'll get more instances in which you falsely believe there is a face, and you'll get fewer instances in which you fail to think there's a face there when there is in fact a face there. So less false negatives, more false positives. Okay, well, what's the cost of a false positive? So you think there's a tiger in the woods, and you go, and you get spooked and you get out of there, right? So that's cost. So you waste your time. You might be a little more nervous or paranoid. And you'll occasionally lose out if you're hunting or foraging or trying to survive on some resource or opportunity because you got too spooked and you ran off. And what's the cost if you're undertuned? Well, that means you're less likely to spot faces that are there. Okay, well, in that case, if you don't spot the tiger, you die. So the rationale here is that the one type of cost is asymmetrically greater than the other type of cost. And so you wouldn't expect us to be perfectly calibrated to detecting faces. You would expect us to be over calibrated to detect faces, because that enhanced sensitivity will, if one person spots a tiger that they otherwise wouldn't have spotted because they're overcorrecting, for every 20, 30, or even 100 times people get spooked, it's still advantageous for them to do that. So that would be the rationale for why we would be extra sensitive. And so what that could show is that even our perception can dupe us for selectively advantageous reasons. So if it works even for perception, that raises doubts about whether our cognitive capacities are fully aligned with detecting what's true. Okay, so I think that's it for this particular video. So I have some disagreements with this video, but it's not one of the ones where I was like, everything in here is wrong. I do, I think that a lot of the disagreements I have are bracketed. So this video is like, look, this is really only for atheist realists. Well, I'm not a realist. I'm not a naturalist either. So, a lot of the concerns here are not direct concerns that I have. Nevertheless, it was fun to review, and I hope you enjoyed it. So do like the video, subscribe to the channel, do all that stuff, and I'll catch y'all later. See you another time. Take care, everybody.